America, we stand for freedom. Though freedom is never really free, we yearn and strive for government protecting our liberty.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Your Right to Know, brought to you by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. Tonight we have a guest on our show that needs no introduction, because not only is he the chairman of the Fitchburg Republican City Committee, but he is also a very well-known and well-respected professor. Is that correct, Doctor?
Retired, yes.
Retired,
yes.
Dr. Strang. Dr. Strang, can you give us a little bit of background information about you?
Okay. As you can see, by the way, I'm pushing my books here.
That's quite okay.
Okay, I was born in Kirtland, Ohio. I entered the Army at age 17, and I served in Germany. After my discharge, I went on to the study of philosophy. I earned undergraduate degrees at Hiram College in Ohio, a master's at University of Kentucky, and a doctorate from Boston University. I also studied at University of Freiburg in Germany. My master's thesis, this may not be of interest necessarily to your audience, but it was on phenomenology. My doctorate was a translation of Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides. I've taught all aspects of philosophy at various colleges in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And my publications include an article, Ethics as Politics, for the 20th World Congress of Philosophy that was held in 1998. I've written to reach popular audiences. I've also written 2 historical philosophical novels, Plans of the Deathless Gods and The Magic Fleet, and I'm working on a 3rd in that series. These are set in the late 18th and early 19th century. And I wrote a tongue-in-cheek memoir of my military service called Veterans of Foreign Whores. This name excited my fellow veterans. I'm not sure, some people are turned off by it, but it sort of reflects where we were. I co-founded the Boston Conservative Society in 1986 and served as its head from 87 to 94. I've been active in Republican politics for 30 years, and as you said, I'm currently the chairman of the city committee here in Fitchburg.
You're a well-respected chairman at that, but it's very interesting how your philosophy, experience translates into your political experience as well. So the point of our program today is liberalism in education. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction as to what you think of the problems in education today?
Sure. The way I would address that is the following. If you ask an ordinary American, what is it that makes him or her an American? Conservatives have little difficulty answering that. They would say, well, it's the Constitution and the other founding documents. Liberals, in my experience, do have difficulty. They'll sort of hem and haw. They're not quite sure, and they might come out with something like, well, we're kind toward one another, and we do good deeds and so on. But specifically, if you pose the question, what makes us Americans, the answer is the Constitution. Ethnically, we have all kinds of differences among us, but what unifies us is the Constitution and the other founding documents. Now, many young people today, and it's not just young people, but it's more pronounced among young people, cannot really answer this question. Mm-hmm. They've been schooled on the virtues of diversity, but they don't really know, well, what makes us unified. Mm-hmm. And this in fact is borne out by something I happened to to print out, so-called Generation Z. By the way, this terminology I hadn't been familiar with. It refers to the post-millennial generation. So this is the most recent generation on the scene, and this account of some of their beliefs it's rather frightening. They on issues ranging across the board, from minorities issues to changes in climate to diversity in society. This Generation Z is a lot more liberal even than their parents or than the millennial generation. They take a more liberal view on the role of government in society, for example, than do millennials. 7 out of 10 of them think that the government should do more to solve problems, while only 30% say the government's doing too much. The point here is that we live in a culture in which increasingly young people, and not just young people, but increasingly young people, don't know why and what makes us Americans because they haven't received an education on this. I'm actually prepared to go into certain areas in which we can see the consequences of this. But they are woefully prepared to understand what it means to be an American because they haven't gotten the prep, essentially.
And you know, when I was, back in the 90s, when I was in high school and college, and I saw the rise of this problem. I remember specifically in high school, there were certain students that refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I mean, there are some schools who don't even recite the Pledge of Allegiance anymore. In fact, it's considered taboo. Do you think that this is part of the problem?
Absolutely.
That was the initial start back in the 90s of the diversity movement. Everybody has to be accepting, which that's fine. But you need to stick with your core values,
right? And
that's what we're getting away from.
Exactly.
So what other than the obvious, not stating the Pledge of Allegiance, but I've also seen, I have a friend. He works at the Sig Sawyer facility up in New Hampshire. His son, high school student, was wearing a SIG T-shirt. He was actually told to either turn it around or you're going to be sent home, because these people were triggered just by a T-shirt.
Right, and we've seen a further example of that just in the past few days, the incidents of the Catholic Covington students who were on a tour in Washington, and I'm sure the audience is aware of what happened here. The students were waiting for their bus, and they were prevailed upon by 2 groups, I think, some group
one was the black Israeli groups.
Black Hebrew Israelites, I think.
Something
sort of
like
a cult group. And the other was a man who presented himself as an Indian chieftain of some sort. He came with a drum. He also claimed he was a Vietnam veteran, which turns out to be false.
That turned out to be false.
But apparently what triggered this effective assault on these young men was that they were all wearing "Make America Great Again" hats. Now, why should that do that? And yet there are so many other cases of this, like the case you illustrate. It's as if young people are being taught they should not even make reference to our history and to the beliefs, the political beliefs that they hold. They should somehow cast these out in favor of politically correct topics, which is something I wanted to go into here.
Please do.
Political correctness is it's a term we all use, but most people don't really know where it came from. The term was actually coined in the 1920s and 30s by Bolsheviks. And their point was that they wanted to shape the way in which other people of the left, who were not yet indoctrinated into full-fledged communism, spoke. So essentially what they did was they started issuing advices about how they should speak about certain topics. You have to address this issue in a, quote, politically correct manner.
Wow.
Now, what is really going on here with this, and it's grown since then. What's going on here is that the Bolsheviks and their followers perceived something very key. They saw that if you can persuade your opponent or even your so-called friends or even neutrals to use language, certain language, and to avoid the use of other language, you will have essentially produced a way to avoid the need of using rhetoric in your actual arguments. Now, classically speaking, and I'm referring back here to the ancient Greeks because they invented it, rhetoric served the function of persuading your opponent. Mm-hmm. You would employ logic, actually. A good rhetorical argument employs logic. So rhetoric was the use of language to persuade someone of a point. If you wanted to win your argument, you persuaded them by means of rhetoric. What happened with the rise of political correctness by the Bolsheviks and their followers was that essentially they dispensed with rhetoric in favor of compelling the language user to refrain from using certain words and to use other words. Now, this of course had the effect of causing them also to refrain from certain ideas. If you're refraining from certain words, certain expressions, it follows also that you are causing them to refrain from certain ideas. So the insight of these extreme leftists was that they could eliminate the need for political discourse by the psychological compulsion of self-censorship.
Wow.
And that's what has happened. That's what political correctness really embodies.
So if we're talking about in the 1920s and the 1930s, with the rise of the communist regime, what exactly were some of the words that they were trying to whitewash, let's just say?
Well, we can begin at the beginning.
I mean, we all know
Bolshevik.
what today. Right.
For example, Bolshevik. The left has always been extremely effective at coining words. Mm-hmm. And the word Bolshevik, actually in Russian, bolshoi means majority or great. Mm-hmm. The word that they have for minority is Menshevik. Now, the earliest of the Bolsheviks, Lenin and his followers, they called themselves the majority, the Bolshoi, the Bolsheviki. Mm-hmm. And they referred to their opponents, who actually were the majority, as the minority. This language caught on, and ever since we refer to them falsely using their terms. The point is that the censorship, and it's a self-censorship which is imposed by political correctness, requires less intellectual effort than persuasion, the classical way in which politicians spoke to one another and tried to persuade one another. It takes years to develop skills in rhetoric. Unfortunately, we don't see these skills developed anymore, so most of our politicians are pretty dreadful arguers. Yeah, but in the case of self-censorship, this doesn't require anything at all. It just requires you to refrain from expressing yourself on certain topics. The effect of this is that you silence yourself, you close yourself off to ideas, and you close off those around you to ideas. So the whole environment becomes one of silence, silencing yourselves, and only saying certain things. And I had some quotations here that apply to this. These are from 3 different people who have all addressed this issue of political correctness from 3 different perspectives. None of them is a conservative, by the way. One is an intelligence analyst named Morabito. She wrote that political correctness provides a semantic fog where manipulation can occur in the guise of being fair or non-discriminatory. And she says there are 3 elements to this. First, you are so subtle that people are unaware that they're being manipulated. The language has changed to achieve thought control, and the practitioner uses the levers of social isolation to force conformity to the elite's control, in this case the leftists' narrative. An example of this would be gender identity theorists who seek a genderless society and are subtly forcing you to use language and hence thought that conforms to that. So you don't debate the issues. Mm-hmm. You just find yourself sort of pulled into language use just like and the assumptions of this use. What
the LGBT community is doing in regards to how many different genders are there now?
Something like a new alphabet.
52 or something like that. That is, that's you're 100% spot on in that regard.
Right. There's another example here. Your viewers may have heard of an Israeli political figure named Natan Sharansky. He too is not a conservative, although he's sometimes been labeled one. He speaks of political correctness as a phenomenon of a minority who does not believe in the values of democracy, confronting a majority which has given up on demanding those values. In other words, there's an assumption here that there's what's taken place is a sort of demoralization in society. And there are many cases of political correctness that we encounter every day, like the word that came up earlier, diversity. This is alleged to be a good thing in a society. But it's striking that the advocates of diversity don't explain why it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Normally, historically, nation states have not retained their identity if they're too diverse. Mm-hmm. The most famous example in modern times would be Austria-Hungary, that had 11 different ethnic groups. Mm-hmm. And the officers in the army could not directly give orders to their soldiers because they didn't speak the same language. Now, do we want a society that diverse? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, it goes to, we started this discussion is what's the meaning of being an American?
Right.
And historically, we've been known as the melting pot, we accept newcomers in, and they adapt to the American way of life. You saw this with
right.
with the Irish, with the Italians, with the Jewish coming over here, in World War II. I mean, you look at Casablanca. You have people that's coming over here from all parts of the globe, and coming to the melting pot and becoming
right.
Americans. We've lost that. We have, I mean, there's nothing wrong with, idolizing your ancestors or, respecting where you've come from, but when you're here, you're an American.
Right. Well, you're speaking to the attitude that I share. It was an attitude that was shared by our parents' generation and their generation before them. Theodore Roosevelt eloquently expressed himself on this. We all have pride in our ancestry, but we also have pride in the fact that we're Americans. Mm-hmm. And the issue is, well, what's the basis of that? And as I said, right now we are witnessing a alteration of the American landscape, in which increasingly young people, and this is true also of those who are not so young, don't know what makes us Americans. Mm-hmm. And this makes us susceptible to all kinds of problems, such as other highly diverse cultures have shared. There are, I was going to mention, maybe it's not necessary to do this in great degree, but some of the examples of current PC language. Undocumented immigrant. Now, illegal alien more factually expresses mm-hmm. what's going on here. Mm-hmm. An undocumented immigrant is undocumented only because he or she is purposely evading becoming documented.
Right. Kind of like a bankrupter making an undocumented withdrawal
exactly,
from a bank.
Right.
Correct.
Right. White privilege. This is alleged to be a trait of Caucasians in particular, across the board. Toxic masculinity. Maybe you've heard this one.
I've definitely heard that one before.
This is alleged to be a trait of males across the board. Safe space, microaggression, trigger warning, and so on. Now these, some of these. Here's some examples of consequences, I should say, of living in a culture which is dominated by political correctness. Recent instances, because Boy Scouts, the expression and the institution, was alleged to be exclusive, and of course they are. I mean, they were exclusive to boys.
Yeah.
Not only was its name changed, but it was opened up to membership by girls. Music teachers in Massachusetts, this goes to what you just expressed, who are required to provide LGBTQ-friendly classrooms. This implies that they are used PC terms such as gender-neutral programs, Z instead of she or he. They are to avoid the expressions boys and girls. They are to distribute LGBTQ-friendly material, provide safe space stickers, promote gay musicians and composers, and so on. Now, let me say something here. I have nothing against gay musicians or gay composers. Some of the great composers of history have been gay. Mm-hmm. Tchaikovsky, for example, or Leonard Bernstein. but they're respected, they're admired not because they're gay, but because they're great composers.
It was music. I mean, music
right,
is
right.
as close to math as you can get. It's their notes and timing,
right.
and that's it. You know,
right.
what the person is should not enter into it. You know, whether they be straight. I mean, you could even look at modern day, you know, songwriters.
Right.
Elton John. You know,
right. Many examples.
There are many different examples. His name just escaped me, but he was, well, doesn't really matter. But you're absolutely right. You know, it doesn't matter what, you know, what person does in their private life. When they put the music out, that's what's supposed to sell.
Right. And the assumption here is that somehow you cannot have a sympathy for somebody unless you make it evident that they belong to a certain category, a certain identity. But what creates...
dividing us, pretty much.
It's dividing us. Yeah, it's not showing what we have in common, but what it's pointing out these diverse factors. The American Psychological Association, you probably have heard this because this just happened in the past few weeks, recently issued a long judgment that declared masculinity to be harmful to society and manhood to be a mental disorder. Now, this is extreme. I mean, we have to admit this.
They weren't saying that in World War II.
No.
When, you know, our boys were over there fighting. And, yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. The actual statement, if I have it here, it condemns, essentially it condemns any expressions of what we would normally call ordinary teenage male behavior. Teenage boys tend to be more aggressive. Boys will be boys. Right. It condemns competition. Now, you know, everybody
gets a trophy.
Right. Exactly. Now, if you think back to the origins of Western civilization, you know, it would be difficult to find a book more seminal than Homer's Iliad. The whole basis of the Iliad is competition.
Right.
You know, one hero goes before another hero about to do battle, and he says, "My father taught me this. Always to win and to overcome all others." Mm-hmm. And this theme comes up time and time again. So competition is inherent in our culture, in our history. This, now we're being told, this is something you got to root out, you got to eliminate.
Well, so what does that mean for, say, the Olympics? Does everybody get the gold medal?
That's exactly right.
Does everybody get the silver medal? You know,
what's the end game on this? Yeah, there wouldn't be any game, actually. Another instance of something that's happening, a school board in North Carolina eliminates the naming of valedictorians because this encourages unhealthy competition among students and hurts feelings. Students at Rutgers University expressed hurt feelings and fear after they heard a lecture by Milo Yiannopoulos, a conservative who was critical of liberal views.
Gay conservative.
Yeah, that's right.
That's correct.
Right. Students at the University of Minnesota say that remembering 9/11 should be discontinued because it's offensive to Muslims. Yale University held a workshop on the historical merits of looting as a form of protest. Students at Oberlin College in Ohio 2 years ago sought abolition of midterms and any grade lower than a C because the demands of their social activism interfered with study.
Wait, hold on. Wait 1 second
it's so
here.
Extreme, it sounds ridiculous.
So they want to get rid of midterm grades,
right,
and basically get rid of anything below a C because their social
activism is impaired otherwise.
Is impaired.
Right.
Isn't that why we went to college?
Exactly.
You know,
see the level of destruction of our educational system, the corrupting of our educational system, and so many other aspects of our lives is so extreme that we find it laughable and incredible that these things are going on.
You know, I think back to the day. I mean, I remember my third grade teacher, and I'm not going to say I was a problem student, but I was definitely one of the ones that asked interesting questions, as I do now. But I remember asking my third grade teacher, well, isn't it true that before the Civil War, how did I phrase it? It's been a while, but didn't the Democrats were against
freeing the slaves.
Freeing the slaves, and weren't they also against civil rights? But now all of a sudden the Republicans are the ones against it? And she goes, yeah, that was changed. And I remember, I was only in third grade, I remember going, I don't think you're right there.
Again, this is a reflection of the ignorance of history that you and I share. We know how it really was, but so many people now, including so-called teachers. I heard a story that a woman who taught school in Chicago, I think, she thought that Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat. And she, in fact, put out a stipulated that her students in her course could never refer to him as a Republican. I mean, there's just fundamental ignorance that is spewing ignorance. It's spreading ignorance.
Well, I mean, we see that. I mean, we saw this at the Fitchburg block party, where
Yes.
you know we had our Republican sign out there. We had our cardboard Donald out there, and I mean, I remember handing a bracelet to a child. And just saying, here you go. It was just nothing more than a rubber bracelet. It had our, Republican City Committee on it. And the mother snatched it out of the kid's hands and threw it back at me, like in disgust.
Right.
Like, how dare you, try to indoctrinate my child? I just gave the kid a bracelet. That's all that I did.
Right.
And you see the ignorance in the people that just don't understand, what the Republican values are.
Right. And that's literally the case. Republican with a small r. They don't understand the values of a republic, which is something else I wanted to briefly speak to. We are surrounded again by people who think that we inhabit a democracy. That's not true. There's an anecdote that goes to the point here. In the end of 1787 in Philadelphia, when the Constitutional Convention finally adjourned, and they'd been sequestered essentially for the summer, a lady is said to have encountered Benjamin Franklin on the street.
Right, I know, yep.
And she said to him, "Dr. Franklin, what form of government have you given us?" And he answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." He didn't say a democracy, if you can keep it. Now, what's significant about this? Well, the point is that at the time, and the Constitution, as written, specified we were not a democracy. A democracy is a conception of an institution that rules by majority. We wanted an institution that protected the rights of minorities, even though our voting system is determined by majorities. So there were and are guarantees for the minority. For minority rights in our form of government. That's not the case in a sheer democracy.
Well, as you can see, from this past presidential election, they want to get rid of the Electoral College, because they want the democracy. They want mob rule. They want majority rule. And going back to an earlier point that you have with the Bolsheviks and being the majority, when actually in reality they were the minority. When you look at the election results, who's in the minority but the big cities, and the rest of the country is red.
That's right.
So it's the Bolshevik rise in America. That's basically what you could label this.
Right. We've had in the recent Congress there's more than one man who's come forward or woman advocating that we eliminate the Electoral College. This comes up periodically. Of course, it would require a constitutional amendment because the Electoral College is specifically mentioned in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. The point is that if we went to a sheer democratic system, this would have the effect of reducing the significance of certain areas of the country to nil virtually, while other areas received all the attention of politicians as well as the government in general. So the Electoral College is an institution that's intrinsic to our form of government. It's not something you could eliminate without consequences.
Have we kept the republic?
The question is, that's a good question. It's something we have to really hold in abeyance now. Well, it's going to be determined by the younger generation how they're going to answer it.
Unfortunately, Doctor, this is a wrap. It's been an interesting half hour, and we would like to thank you for coming on the show. It's always great to have you on. You're very informative, and this has been a fantastic discussion. We would like to thank you for watching Your Right to Know and sitting with the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. As we leave you, we want you to remember that your local city and town Republican Committee is the only grassroots organization that supports and holds dear your liberty, your constitutional rights, and your conservative values. We encourage you to join us. Why? Because to us, GOP stands for growth, opportunity, and prosperity. And because we always stand for freedom. Good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So let us all unite to yearn and strive for our republic that reflects our values, that preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights, and goes forth in power